It was the deep dark before dawn, in the winter of 1811. On the Mississippi River, flatboat crews slept in the cold, their vessels tied to the muddy banks near the Kentucky and Missouri shores. These were rough men, hauling flour, whiskey, and iron down river toward New Orleans. They knew the current the way they knew their own hands. The Mississippi flowed south. It always flowed south. That was the one certainty of their world. Then the certainty broke. In the black hours of December 16th, the ground convulsed. Boatmen were thrown from their beds as the water rose in monstrous, churning walls. Trees along the banks snapped and toppled into the flood. Whole sections of shoreline tore loose and slid into the river. And then the boatmen saw something no riverman had ever reported. The current stopped. The great southern flow hesitated, boiled, and appeared to run the wrong way. Waves surged upstream. Boats that should have drifted toward New Orleans were dragged north, back the way they had come. To terrified crews clinging to their decks, it looked as if the Mississippi itself had reversed, as if the river had decided to flow backward toward its source. Men prayed. Men screamed. Some believed the world was ending. In an age without seismographs, without newspapers reaching the frontier for weeks, there was no explanation, only fear. The story would spread up and down the valley, growing with every retelling. The night the mightiest river in North America turned and ran backward. It sounds like a tall tale, a legend spun by frightened rivermen in a whiskey haze. But it was real. Eyewitnesses recorded it. The event was part of a series of earthquakes so violent they would permanently reshape the American heartland. Quakes felt more than 1,000 miles away. What could possibly force a river the size of the Mississippi to defy its own current? To understand how the water turned, we must first travel back to the fragile frontier world that stood in the path of the disaster, to a small settlement that was about to vanish beneath the shaking earth. In 1811, the town of New Madrid sat on the west bank of the Mississippi River, in what was then the Louisiana Territory, a remote outpost of the young American nation. It had been founded in the 1780s, dreamed up as a grand trading city. The reality was far humbler. Perhaps a few hundred people lived there, French and American settlers, traders, farmers, and their families, in log cabins and simple frame houses clustered near the water. New Madrid survived on the river. Flatboats and keelboats stopped to trade, carrying goods between the frontier and the port of New Orleans downstream. Beyond the town stretched a landscape of dense hardwood forest, canebrakes, and swampy bottomland. Cottonwoods and cypress lined the banks. The soil was rich, laid down over thousands of years by the flooding Mississippi. It was fertile ground for farming, and though no one understood it, the very softness of that ground would make the coming disaster far worse. This was the edge of the known United States. The country was barely 35 years old. Thomas Jefferson had recently completed the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, doubling the nation's size. Explorers Lewis and Clark had only just returned. West of the Mississippi lay vast, unmapped territory, home to native nations who had lived on these lands for countless generations. Communication was agonizingly slow. News traveled by horse and by boat. A letter from New Madrid might take weeks to reach Washington. There was no warning system, no scientific understanding of earthquakes, and certainly no knowledge that a massive, ancient fault system lay buried deep beneath the settlers' feet. To the people of New Madrid, the land was solid, permanent, dependable. They built their lives on that assumption. They planted crops, raised children, and traded their goods, never imagining that the earth itself was the greatest threat they would ever face. That winter, the region was quiet, cold, and unremarkable. Nothing suggested that within hours, this ordinary frontier town would become the center of one of the most powerful earthquake sequences in American history. The first blow was about to fall before the sun rose on December 16th. At approximately 2:15 in the morning on December 16, 1811, the ground beneath the New Madrid region ruptured. The first great earthquake struck without warning. Modern estimates place its magnitude somewhere between 7.2 and 8.0, among the most powerful quakes ever recorded in the eastern United States. In New Madrid, chaos erupted in total darkness. Cabins shuddered and collapsed. Chimneys crumbled. Furniture skidded across floors. Terrified families stumbled outside into the freezing night, only to find the ground itself heaving beneath them, impossible to stand on. The roar was deafening, a sound witnesses compared to distant thunder or artillery. The air filled with the stench of sulfur and the choking dust of pulverized earth. Along the riverbanks, the destruction was catastrophic. Great slabs of land calved off and plunged into the Mississippi. Trees whipped back and forth so violently their tops touched the ground, then snapped and crashed down. The river erupted into violence, throwing up waves that swamped boats and drowned crews. Some vessels were dashed against the collapsing banks. Others were sucked into whirlpools that opened without warning in the churning water. For the settlers, there was no frame of reference for what was happening. Many believed it was divine judgment, the end of days foretold in Scripture. They dropped to their knees in the snow and prayed. Others simply ran, not knowing where safety could be found when the earth itself had become the enemy. The shaking did not stop with one blow. Aftershocks rolled through the region relentlessly, hour after hour. By some accounts, hundreds of tremors were felt in the days that followed. Each new jolt renewed the terror, keeping exhausted survivors from any rest, uncertain whether the next shock would swallow them whole. When a gray dawn finally broke, it revealed a transformed world. The familiar landscape was scarred and broken, but the strangest phenomena were only beginning. As the sun rose, witnesses would see the very ground come alive in ways that defied all understanding, the earth spitting sand and water, cracking open, and breathing like a living thing. What they saw next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As daylight spread across the shattered frontier, survivors beheld a landscape that seemed to belong to a nightmare. The solid earth they had always trusted was behaving like something alive. Everywhere the ground had split open. Long fissures, some several feet wide, tore across fields and forests running for hundreds of yards. Some cracks were deep enough to swallow livestock and even people. Witnesses reported leaping across newly opened chasms, terrified that the earth might close again and crush them. But the most astonishing phenomenon was the sand blows. Deep beneath the surface, the violent shaking had liquefied the water-saturated sandy soil, a process scientists now call liquefaction. Trapped water and sand were forced upward under enormous pressure, bursting through the surface in eruptions that shot mud, sand, and water high into the air. Across the region, the ground appeared to spout like geysers. When the eruptions subsided, they left behind cones and craters of pale sand scattered over the darkened land, some of which remain visible today. The earth itself seemed to breathe. Waves rolled visibly across the surface of the ground, as if it had become an ocean of soil. Witnesses described the solid land rising and falling in swells that made trees sway and toppled those standing upon them. Some observers saw the surface roll in undulations 2 or 3 feet high. In places, entire sections of ground lifted upward, while others sank, dropping several feet in an instant. Water burst upward, carrying not only sand but coal, and a foul-smelling vapor that hung over the wreckage. The mingling of these gases and the fine dust turned the air dark and acrid. Domestic animals panicked and fled. Wild creatures, disoriented, ran toward the terrified people as if seeking protection. It was as though the ordinary rules of nature had been suspended. These bizarre effects, the fissures, the sand blows, the heaving waves of earth, were more than curiosities. They held the key to solving the greatest mystery of the entire disaster. For it was these very forces, working upon the riverbed itself, that would create the illusion that stunned the boatmen, the Mississippi flowing backward. The explanation lay in the violent reshaping of the river's own bed. So how could a river as vast as the Mississippi appear to run backward? The answer lies not in magic or myth, but in the violent physics of that night. The legend is real, but the reversal was not a true, sustained reversal of the entire river. It was a combination of several dramatic effects working together. The first factor was uplift. During the earthquakes, the land in certain areas was thrust upward. In places along and beneath the river, the earth heaved, raising the riverbed and creating temporary barriers, ridges of rock and sediment forced up across the channel. These sudden obstructions blocked the natural, downstream flow, causing water to pool and pile up behind them. The second factor was displacement. As enormous slabs of riverbank collapsed and huge waves surged across the water, the Mississippi was thrown into violent turbulence. Great waves, sometimes called seismic seiches, sloshed back and forth. When water backed up behind a newly formed uplift or landslide dam, it had nowhere to go but backward, upstream, temporarily overriding the normal current. To boatmen caught in the middle, the effect was unmistakable. Their vessels, which should have drifted south, were carried north as the impounded water surged upstream. The current visibly reversed. Waterfalls, or rapids, formed where the riverbed had been raised, and boats were swept over them or sucked into whirlpools. These reversals were temporary, lasting only hours, until the water finally breached the barriers and resumed its southward course. But for those who witnessed it, the impression was permanent and terrifying. The mightiest river on the continent had defied nature itself. The phenomenon was so extraordinary that it entered American folklore, growing with each retelling. Yet the core of the story is scientifically sound. The earthquakes were powerful enough to reshape the very bed of the Mississippi, if only briefly. What the boatmen saw was not superstition. It was the raw, measurable force of the earth in motion. And remarkably, the great disaster was far from finished. The December shocks were only the opening act. In the weeks to come, the region would be struck again by earthquakes even more violent, tremors that would finish the destruction of New Madrid itself. The people of New Madrid believed the worst had passed. For weeks after December 16th, aftershocks rattled the frozen wilderness, but the ground held. Then, before dawn on January 23, 1812, the earth convulsed again. This second great shock, estimated near magnitude 7.5, tore fresh fissures across the landscape and toppled the chimneys that survivors had rebuilt. Cabins that still stood after December splintered into ruin. Along the riverbanks, entire acres slumped into the Mississippi, carrying trees and soil beneath the brown water. Boatmen who had lingered near the settlement watched the shoreline dissolve before their eyes. Yet even this was not the end. On February 7th, 1812, the most violent shock of the entire sequence struck. Contemporary accounts describe a roar louder than thunder, followed by a heaving of the earth so severe that men could not stand. The town of New Madrid, already crippled, was destroyed. Its riverfront collapsed into the channel. Great sections of bank, some measured in hundreds of yards, sheared away and vanished. Near the settlement, waterfalls formed where the riverbed suddenly dropped, hurling flatboats into churning rapids. Eyewitness Eliza Bryan recorded that the atmosphere filled with sulfurous vapor and total darkness, the screams of settlers mixing with the shrieks of wild animals. The riverbanks near the Kentucky and Tennessee shores caved in for miles. Boats were swamped and crews drowned in waters that surged upstream and back with terrifying force. When daylight returned, the survivors emerged to a transformed world. The town they had built was gone, its foundations swallowed or buried under sand. Families who had endured December and January now abandoned the region entirely, fleeing on foot and by wagon into the interior. New Madrid, once a hopeful outpost of 100 souls, ceased to exist as it had been. The three principal shocks and their thousands of aftershocks had rewritten the geography of the entire mid-continent. But the destruction was not confined to Missouri. Hundreds of miles away, in cities that had never felt such violence, people began to sense something impossible. The tremors were traveling farther than anyone imagined possible, reaching a startled and unprepared young nation. The New Madrid earthquakes did not stay in the wilderness. Their energy radiated outward through ancient, rigid bedrock, carrying the shaking across an astonishing expanse of the young United States. In Louisville, Kentucky, residents felt the ground roll beneath their streets. In Cincinnati, buildings swayed, but the most famous reports came from far to the east. In Charleston, South Carolina, more than 700 miles away, church bells reportedly rang on their own, set swinging by tremors that had crossed half a continent. Similar accounts emerged from Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia, where residents felt their homes tremble and plaster crack. In Boston, more than 1,000 miles distant, some claimed to feel the faint pulse of the earth. The reason lay in geology. Unlike the fractured crust of the West Coast, the stable, cold rock of Central and Eastern North America transmits seismic waves with remarkable efficiency, spreading their reach across vast distances. So the New Madrid shocks were felt across an area estimated at roughly 2 million square miles, an unprecedented footprint for any earthquake in recorded American history. For a nation barely 3 decades old, still counting fewer than 8 million citizens, the meaning of such shaking was profound and frightening. This was an era steeped in superstition and religious anxiety. Many interpreted the trembling ground as divine judgment. Camp meetings swelled with terrified believers. Preachers warned of the world's end. Some pointed to the great comet of 1811, blazing in the sky throughout that autumn as a heavenly omen fulfilled by the Earth's violence. Even the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, some later claimed, had prophesied the shaking. Newspapers in Philadelphia and New York printed alarmed accounts from distant correspondents, weaving the disaster into the national consciousness. For weeks, the country wondered whether the ground would ever settle. Slowly, the aftershocks faded, and the eastern cities returned to routine. But in the river country of Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky, the land itself had been permanently altered. When the survivors surveyed what remained, they found forests standing in new lakes, hills lowered, and swamps where dry ground had been. The map of the region would never look the same again. When the shaking finally ceased, the earthquakes left permanent scars carved into the heart of the continent. The most dramatic was Reelfoot Lake, in the northwestern corner of Tennessee. During the violent shocks, the ground subsided, dropping the land by several feet across a broad area. Water from the Mississippi and surrounding streams flooded into the newly sunken basin. Where forest and farmland had stood, a shallow lake spread out, eventually covering roughly 15,000 acres. Reelfoot remains today, its dark waters still studded with the skeletal trunks of bald cypress trees, the drowned survivors of the original forest. Elsewhere, the land bore other marks. Sand blows, some hundreds of feet across, left pale scars of ejected sediment across the countryside, visible even now from the air. Vast stretches of riverbank had collapsed, and new fissures split fields and forests. Sunken lands formed where the ground had dropped, creating swamps and marshes across parts of Missouri and Arkansas. In some places, the earth had lifted instead of sinking, forming low ridges and altering the flow of streams. The Mississippi itself was reshaped. Islands vanished. New channels opened, while old ones filled with debris. The riverbed shifted, and the great waterway that boatmen thought they knew had to be relearned. Navigation along this crucial commercial artery was disrupted for years, as pilots charted the transformed course. The human toll drove a lasting policy response. In 1815, Congress passed the New Madrid Relief Act, one of the first federal disaster relief measures in American history, offering displaced landowners new claims elsewhere in the Missouri Territory. Yet the region itself remained sparsely settled for decades, a landscape of drowned trees, quaking bogs, and unstable ground that seemed to remember its violence. For generations, the New Madrid earthquakes faded into legend, remembered as folk tales of a river that ran backward. But the fault that caused them did not vanish. It merely fell silent. Deep beneath the fertile farmland and growing cities of the mid-continent, the same geological forces that shattered 1811 remain, locked and waiting. And modern scientists have come to understand a sobering truth about this quiet, forgotten seam in the earth. Today, geologists call it the New Madrid seismic zone, a network of buried faults stretching roughly 150 miles through Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Unlike California's San Andreas Fault, this zone lies far from any plate boundary, hidden deep beneath the sediment of the Mississippi Valley. For most of the year, it is utterly silent, yet instruments record hundreds of tiny tremors annually, faint reminders that the ancient fault system remains alive. The concern is not merely historical. The region that felt only scattered frontier cabins in 1811 now holds millions of people. Memphis, Tennessee, and St. Louis, Missouri both sit within reach of the zone, along with countless towns, highways, pipelines, and bridges. And because the stable bedrock of the central United States carries seismic energy so efficiently, a major New Madrid earthquake would shake a far larger area than a comparable quake in the West. Scientists estimate that a repeat of the 1811 to 1812 events could damage structures across multiple states, threatening a modern infrastructure never designed with such violence in mind. Studies of ancient sand blows reveal that the fault has produced major earthquakes repeatedly over the past several thousand years, roughly every 500 years on average. The precise timing of the next great shock cannot be predicted, but the geological record is clear that the events of 1811 were not a singular freak of nature. They were part of a long, recurring rhythm written into the earth beneath the American heartland. This is the enduring lesson of New Madrid. The story that began with astonished boatmen watching the Mississippi appear to flow backward is not simply a tale from the past. It is a warning encoded in Reelfoot Lake, in the buried sand blows, in the drowned cypress trees still standing in dark water, the ground that seems most stable, the quiet farmland far from any coast, can hold forces capable of reshaping a continent. Beneath the calm surface of the Mississippi Valley, the fault waits, silent and patient for its next release. And so the truth remains, unsettling and undeniable. The heartland hides a sleeping giant.